This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this symposium. The aim of this symposium is to examine the relationship between creative intellectuals and power. Creative in the sense that their main activity is imaginative and not political. The question is, if politicians and writers don't think in the same way, how well each side understands the other and how much they are useful to each other. We have a very distinguished little panel here. Francis Stonor Saunders, on the left, wrote the seminal book, Who Paid the Piper? Came out in 1999, and it's full of the research of the relationship of the CIA and Encounter and the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It's also a very polemical book. She's very passionate about what she feels is the exploitation of free and creative people by invisible offstage forces, and she's still just as passionate today, because we had lunch together, as she was 11 years ago when she published her book. We also have Maren, who's from Munich. She is in charge of the Lasky Center for Transatlantic Studies. This is an affiliation of the America House of Munich. The America House, or maybe the America Houses, were started by the American occupation forces in Germany in various cities, and they were sort of nucleus of American cultural activities. But it's now run by Bavaria. It's part of the land of Bavaria, presumably, and so it has no connection with the United States. She received a large number of papers from Melvin Lasky's widow, and she's going through them, and they're in great disorder, and eventually she will write a biography of Melvin Lasky. We also have James Smith, who is a postdoctoral fellow at New College, Oxford, and he's about to publish a book called British Writers and the Files of MI5. These files were released about 6 or 7 years ago. My father is in them, and Auden and Isherwood are in them, and various other intellectuals, and it shows how the MI5 and various other parts, you'll explain, kept an eye on British intellectuals. Very distant and benign eye in many cases. And then we also have Jason Harding. Jason Harding is at Durham University, and he's working on the T.S. Eliot project here at London University. And he has read all of Encounter magazine with a view to trying to understand the editorial policy of who was influential on who. There was a difference of strategy between Melvin Lasky and Stephen Spender in the publication, in the editorial editing of the magazine. And he'll be telling us about that. I'm going to limit myself to saying a brief resume of Spender's political activities before Encounter, and then very briefly on Encounter itself, leaving the word on Encounter to people who are better equipped than I am. So, Spender left Oxford without taking a degree in 1929, and he went to stay in Berlin with his friends Auden and Isherwood, and the three of them saw at close hand the rise of Hitler and the ruthlessness of the Nazi Party, and they became convinced that the Nazis should be stopped at practically any price, and that England was completely unaware of how serious the Nazi threat was. Indeed, in the background of their protests lay the fact that many people in England at the time thought that it was in the best interests of England to make an alliance with Germany against Russia. They took the opposite point of view. So when following his career through the files of MI5, one of the interesting things is how MI5's view slightly shifts, realizing that national policy is going to go in a different direction than were first thought. In 1936, there were the Moscow trials, which was the first moment when a certain doubt about the alliance with Russia seemed crept into everyone's minds. But it was followed almost immediately by the Spanish Civil War, with General Franco attempting successfully to overthrow the Republican government. Stephen Spender, with his usual luck, was in Spain just shortly before the revolt. He and Escherwood went to Sintra in Portugal in order to live a life with their boyfriends, far from the national crowd. It wasn't very successful, this communal living, but it did place them in the right place at the right time to see at close quarters Franco's attempt to take over the Republic. He went 3 times to Spain, and each time was more curious than the last. The first time he was sent by the British Communist Party to trace a Russian ship which was taking supplies to the Republican government. This ship disappeared, and he was sent to find it. Well, of all the least qualified persons to send to find a missing Russian cargo ship, I should think a young poet is probably the least. So there is the doubt that maybe the communists of Great Britain thought it would be good about the idea if he got himself caught and shot, like Garcia Lorca, thereby providing the cause with a martyr. Anyway, he drifted around Spain, he didn't get shot, he came back, and he'd actually even found out where this ship was, and almost immediately he joined the English Communist Party with an article in the Daily Worker on the 19th of February 1937, and immediately afterwards he went to Spain for a second time to run a radio station in Valencia. But when he got there, he found the job had been abolished, so he had nothing to do. He then tried to trace his boyfriend, Tony Hyman, who had gotten into trouble with the International Brigade. He deserted from the front line and was under arrest, and indeed he had a serious chance of being either shot or eliminated in one of those frontline accidents that had already occurred to one of his best friends. It's one of the strangest war stories of all time. You know, as a poet who's there as a representative or a spokesman of the Communist Party trying to get his boyfriend out of the front line, and in a showdown with Harry Pollitt, who was the head of the English Communist Party at the time. Pollitt asked him, is there any love involved in this attempt to save Tony Hyman? And my father said yes, which is an amazing scene. Anyway, a deal was worked out between Pollitt and Spender, and Pollitt agreed to appear at all the meetings which were going to take place in favour of Republican Spain. And he was very regular and dutiful, and he was followed wherever he went by MI5, which is one of the few ways we have of recording how many times he spoke on behalf of Republican Spain. Then he broke. In the third meeting, a visit to Spain, he went to a writers' congress, which was extremely embarrassing. The cause was almost lost. These writers were being wined and dined, and he felt totally embarrassed. Wrote some very good poems, but the situation was very good. Then, but he found himself a victim of a sort of slander campaign by the English Communist Party. And he protested to Harry Pollitt in a letter which is in the MI5 file. During the past few days I've written several articles about Spain which should be useful propaganda. My wish is that my position should not be so seriously weakened by parochial gossip and amateur espionage that it is impossible for me to do the work I still want to do within the party. The reason why I make these points is that his dislike of communism came from first-hand experience. It wasn't just simply an intellectual shifting of opinion. He'd actually been victimized, not nearly to the extent that somebody like Arthur Koestler had been victimized, but he certainly knew what the parameters of working for the communists were, and quite early, 1937. During the Second World War, he was turned down for active service, and so the first 2 years of the war he spent co-editing Horizon magazine with Cyril Connolly. And he drifted away from Horizon magazine mainly because Connolly wanted to publish creative writing. He wanted to write stories, Connolly was a very idiosyncratic editor. He really published exactly what he wanted, and the magazine was bought and read partly for the comments, the introductions to each number, which were always extremely zany and unpredictable. And in its way, the whole magazine is a very low-key anti-war protest. It says culture will continue in spite of the war. We don't have to become involved with this thing. But strangely enough, Spender at that point felt that it should be more implicated with political decisions, because the war was, after all, about certain causes, and that these things ought to be discussed. In 1943, November 1943, he was vetted by MI5, and the conclusion was this. Stephen Spender, like several other young and progressive thinkers, joined the Communist Party in the days of the United Front because he saw in this the only way to combat fascism. His behaviour and writings of recent years show that he is no longer in sympathy with communism, and in fact will have nothing more to do with them. There's no security objection to his employment by PWE on the continent. PWE is Political Warfare Executive, which is the white and black propaganda, which the official historian of which is in fact a writer called David Garnett. And this is, as it were, the genealogical tree of the secret services which, coming out of Spender's life, begins with PWE. He joined the fire service. In the fire service, he managed to miss the Blitz, and he also missed the V1s and V2s. So his fire service was extremely dull. He was on duty, but there was nothing happening. So he started an education program, which is a sort of semi-official initiative of some kind. It was, as it were, signalling to, or making some gesture towards being part of the establishment, because it was, a part of the apparatus of instruction. And this is something that he was very keen on. But he did not rise above the rank of humble fireman. He didn't really make it to corporal, or whatever it is. So he had no experience of military command. He tried to, he left the fire service in June of 1944, and a month later he started working for the Political Intelligence Department. The PID was an affiliate of the Foreign Office, so it's a little bit distinct from PWE, and it was quartered in Bush House, which is where the BBC was stationed. And it had letter paper with a telephone number on it, so how secret this PID was, I don't know. He went for an interview with the Allied Control Commission, because at that point he wanted to go to Germany and take part in the reconstruction of culture in Germany. This was a subject which had no interest officially. The war was still going on. If there was a major discussion about the war aims, it had to do with whether the total destruction of Germany by aerial bombardment would leave an impossible logistical problem after the war. That was about as far as official thinking could reach. And in a slightly larger political sphere, one notes that there was no attempt to create a united Europe, which would have been perfectly much more simple to do in London during the war than it was going to be subsequently. So he talked about the problem of recreating culture in Europe after the war. He was interviewed by the Allied Control Commission and turned down, because mainly he said, I need to see this man, Ernst Roberts Curtius, who was my mentor before the war, and he will be able to tell me exactly what the intellectual reaction to the Nazis was, and whether there's any chance of reconstructing a cultural existence in Germany after the war. But this was turned down because it didn't coincide with any of the aims of the Allied Control Commission. During this period, nevertheless, either back from the British Council or the Pen Club or even the BBC. He visited various congresses held in Paris and in Toulouse and Montpellier and Geneva, which were discussing the reconstruction of Germany after the war. He finally got himself to Germany with the duty of filing a secret report, which was only declassified in 2004, which is what steps should be taken for this problem of reconstruction. His recommendation was to concentrate on educating the people at university level or below university level. The difficulty was that all the teachers, in fact all the apparatus in Germany, had been totally Nazified, and it was extremely difficult to find an alternative cadre of teachers who could take over the responsibility of teaching with what textbooks. There were no textbooks. There was no coordinated strategy of what should be taught or who would teach it. So he wrote a popular book called European Witness about his experiences in Germany. But unfortunately, Curtius, whom he quoted, was extremely angry that this book had come out without allowing Curtius to see it first. And this led to a long wrangle involving Curtius, Spender and T.S. Eliot, because T.S. Eliot had had a long relationship with Curtius. Curtius had been the first translator of The Wasteland, and so he acted as an umpire. And in his attempt to calm down Curtius from one of these, the fifth or sixth or seventh angry letter from Curtius, Eliot writes back, Spender is a liberal and therefore tends to intolerance and to judging others. And he tends to take an unctuously superior tone on the basis of very imperfect understanding. After a while, Spender got bored with this wrangle about Curtius and Eliot, and he sent Eliot a plan for an international magazine that was to be published in Germany and in France and in England after the war. And obviously Curtius is the one person that he wanted to be co-editor, and he just lost his friendship for all time. So it was very difficult to get this idea started. This indicates that he was still wanting, A, to start a magazine of a political kind in Europe after the war, and B, was interested in European identity as opposed to the relationship between England and America. But this began to change. I think, privately, it's difficult to assess this, but going to all those congresses, he saw the phalanx of the French Communist Party or the Italian Communist Party, and just realized that alone, without any interest in part of the United Kingdom, it would be very difficult to make any headway in the highly tactical world of these organized communist parties. So in 1948, he wrote a very pessimistic article in New York Times magazine, which takes for granted that Europe will go communist, and therefore the struggle for hearts and minds, if we want to put it that way, will have to take place in a political sphere and not in a cultural sphere. Cultural freedom and the freedom of the individual within an externally influenced political system are among the realist issues in Europe today, when Europeans are prepared to resign themselves to the loss of internal political sovereignty if they can continue to enjoy such freedoms. In a continent bored with the results of political blunders and suspicious of all propaganda, this would be the most realistic way of gaining support. For what is realistic today is to expect nothing of political propaganda and political bludgeoning, but to take part in showing Europeans the greatest contemporary achievements of American civilization in education and culture. This sort of fitted into I don't know whether to talk about left wing or right wing, but a certain group of American intellectuals who thought that one should support the non-communist left against the communist, or threat of communism. And that's basically the premise of both Spender's and Lasky's Future magazine. And then the Congress of Cultural Freedom, I'll leave others to talk about. It was instantly recognized that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was pushing American propaganda. It was one of the first two visitors to the first Congress were Freddie Eyre and Hugh Trevor Roper, and they wrote articles saying this quite clear: the Congress for Cultural Freedom is a compromised institution. There's a leader in the Manchester Guardian at the time. Cultural freedom includes the freedom to discuss cultural freedom, meaning that they thought that this was slightly too much propaganda. And there again, that's another of the background of this this who controls culture, is whether it should be overt or how close it should be to the driving seat, as it were, in selling or forcing culture or directing culture as a form of political manipulation. So, Encounters magazine was founded. There were 3 editors. The first one was Irving Kristol, who came from the Trotsky wing of the American Communist Party, Dwight MacDonald, who was a maverick, Trotskyite also, and then it ended up with Melvin Lasky, whom Maren will be able to describe much better than I can. The tensions between Spender and these American editors had a lot to do with Trotsky, because these New York intellectuals came from a background which they took for granted. They spoke a sort of dialect of their own, which was goes back to 1932, the attempt to put Trotsky on trial. But Spender thought these were just simply eccentricities. And so one of the nicknames he had for Dwight MacDonald was Cracklepot. Cracklepot is half crackpot, and this is in a letter to Reynolds Price, and half cracker barrel. Cracker barrel is when you exchange homely bits of political wisdom over a cracker barrel, and crackpot is the English equivalent of being slightly more nutty. Cracklepot is delivering fiery attacks because we refused an article he wrote on America, which appears in Dissent. He says we refused it because of the extraneous influence of the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which cannot tolerate fearless anti-American honesty like cracklepots. I have written him a letter which took me a week to compose and which still keeps me awake most nights, thinking of phrases which could have had a few more barbs tacked on. What is really annoying about the cracklepots is that they drag one down in their polemics and controversies, so that you end up washing each other's dirty linen in public and raking round the ashes of bygone schismatic days. In the back pages of Dissent, there's a ridiculous 3-sided epistolary controversy between Cracklepot, Harold Rosenberg, and Paul someone or other, I think that's Paul Goodman, on the theme, does Cracklepot have good taste in the fine arts, or is he just a kitschy old Philistine? So, among themselves, there was already an intrinsic difference between almost any American editor who came to help take over the American side of Encounter magazine. Now, how much was it CIA run and how much it was English run? In the files of MI5, there's a continual discussion between the English office and the American officers. The American officers wanted things to be far more geared towards propaganda in favor of the United States, and the English were far more keen on supporting anybody who wasn't a Stalinist. This was the point of view, really, from the immediate post-war period, constantly throughout. The Brits said anybody who is not an outright Stalinist should be given encouragement. There's an interesting document published in, a circular, secret circular in 1959, saying that giving a list of Communist Front trade union organizations and then giving another list of our equivalents, that is to say that's on being supported by Britain and the United States. And the Congress of Cultural Freedom is in this list. The purpose of the first Congress of Cultural Freedom, held in West Berlin, was to counter the communist-sponsored Congress of Intellectuals at Wrocław, from which the World Peace Council derives. The CCF, whose members are eminent intellectuals, defends anti-totalitarian principles in all countries of the world. Besides literary periodicals in English, French, and German, it has produced reports on such subjects as science and freedom, the Soviet economy, and the Hungarian Revolution. the organization is largely American finance. This flat statement, they are paying for it. So, all right, okay, I think I've said enough to introduce the background. Spender and Lasky were allergic to each other in terms of behavior, choice of material to be included in the magazine. The strange thing is that whereas Spender during the Second World War wanted Horizon to become more political, by the 1950s he wanted exactly the opposite. He wanted Encounter to be a cultural magazine which had very little politics in it. In these editorial disputes, which filled, I'm told, 104 large packing cases in Boston, unsorted, unchronological, the constant plea for space by Spender was always eliminated with the need to publish a political article immediately, because political articles, like omelettes, have to come out fresh. So this was the end of their relationship decayed long before the business about the CIA began to rear its ugly head. That began in 1963 with an article by Conor Cruz O'Brien reviewing the whole of Number, and in my opinion at the time, because after all I am involved in this, he should have resigned then. It was amply discussed, this business about the CIA from 1963 onwards. Spender's response was to ask information of his superiors, is it true that the CIA is paying for Encounter? He only, in the end, resigned in 1967, so that's really quite a long time. That's 4 or 5 years, during which he stuck to his post and insisted on a reply. In my opinion, by doing so, by not being, as it were, savvy and resigning immediately, he actually placed the Congress of Cultural Freedom in a very embarrassing situation, because for 4 or 5 years they've been absolutely lying about their existence. If he'd resigned in 1963, then they might have been able to pull everything together and continue. It's my minority opinion. Frances, to give her view of the Cultural Cold War.
Thank you, Matthew. You said that the audience tonight, in an email to me, would be select, so I'm taking it as a given that, and in any case, Matthew's now covered a lot of territory, but that you will be interested in or have some knowledge of the cultural Cold War, the cultural aspect of the Cold War, and specifically high culture, and specifically that part of high culture that was in an institutional relationship with the espionage arm of the US government, and to a lesser degree, that of the British government. I think, so I'll give the roughest shorthand of how I see the cultural Cold War taking off, which is that a bunch of intellectuals who were loosely assembled around the designation the non-communist left, which they were in the main happy to accept, started to ponder the role of high culture in after the Stunde Null, the 0 hour of fascism. Remember that in 1940, Orwell had said that the democratic vistas have ended in barbed wire, and although briefly after the fall of the Third Reich there was a view of a slightly better horizon, it was not too soon after that that the Cold War positions started to congeal, and the barbed wire was replaced by or complemented by what we now know as the Iron Curtain. At the same time as these intellectuals were gathering around the idea of mounting a defence of high culture and against the encroachment of communist ideas, the foreign policy and espionage elite, if you like, of America and again of Britain were discussing pretty much the same idea, how they could respond to the Soviet Union that had already stolen a march in the early salvos of the Cold War in the cultural field. And what happened was that these two distinct entities, kind of in degrading orbit, like on a casino roulette wheel, came to rest on the same centre of gravity. They reached an accommodation that involved different degrees of wittiness. The scale covers from people who knew from the very beginning, who knew exactly what the institutional relationship with the CIA was, to people who kind of suspected it, and to people who said they didn't know, but it's possible that they didn't know because they didn't want to know. And we'll come back to this question of Stephen and his inquiries into the truth of the matter and why he hesitated for as long as he did to resign. Wrote to the same cause, they proceeded to mount an organised global campaign to roll back communist and socialist thought and advance the merits of a liberal capitalist democracy as the guaranteed custodian of free democratic values in the post-war world. Worldwide, the mechanisms of this covert operation were pretty much the same. It involved dummy foundations, passing money to individuals or magazines or organisations, host organisations that could act as fronts, a lot of what they call black bagging at the beginning, which was literally CIA agents carrying around bin bags full of cash. You know, you have to remember that in Europe, immediately after the war, there was no money to be had, there wasn't a dime to be had anywhere. So this was how, and there was no real mechanism for initially to move this money, this umbilical cord of gold that linked them to Washington, to move it around. So it was kind of basic and some brown envelopes. So that persisted actually, interestingly, for quite a while. So these forces coalesce, sometimes accidentally and at other times quite programmatically, and a sort of agreement and a modus operandi is fashioned. Out of it will come the newborn Euro-American mind. I think that was Lasky's phrase. E.P. Thompson later called it the NATO-politan mind, describing not just political and military institutions, obviously, but a mentality that spread over a great deal of activity and thought. And to describe, I think, culture having become like a Minuteman missile, a weapon in the Cold War. How this arsenal was arranged, the choice of targets, the deployment procedures, etc., was in the main decided by the CIA. And here I take issue with the thesis that's been advanced by Hugh Wilford, who's done a lot of research on the IRD and done really, really important work, and with Matthew, who's been looking through the files in the Public Records Office, the National Archives. I think it's very important to say that the files, my experience of researching this story was that the files only tell you part of the narrative. There's something about the act of committing certain knowledge or information or research to paper, particularly in the intelligence community. I mean, a lot of it simply is not, there isn't a paper trail. It's in interviewing people who were involved that you find out that a lot of the organisation and construction of this thing was going on, in a parallel fashion. So I'm not convinced that that MI6 played as big a role, or rather its cover office, the Information and Research Department. I love that Orwellian euphemism, as is claimed by the IRD and advocates of the IRD. I think that the debilitating effects of all those double agent scandals that rocked British intelligence in the 50s and 60s shouldn't be underestimated. They delivered the upper hand absolutely to the American spy fraternity, and this they ruthlessly exploited. And I think that any claim to the contrary is a self-aggrandizing myth. The official authorised biography of MI6 by Professor Christopher Andrews is case in point. I think the best way to think of it is in the context of the cultural Cold War, not the rest of it necessarily, that think of the CIA as Rupert Murdoch and British intelligence as James. That was kind of the command structure. In any case, as MI6 officer and cultural warfare fixer Malcolm Muggeridge pointed out, the Americans were far better endowed. They had the cash and how it flowed. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, which Matthew mentioned, was the centrepiece of the CIA's covert apparatus, launched in Berlin in 1950 and then moved to Paris. It was a hugely costly operation, even by today's standards. I mean, towards the end, I think in the mid-60s, it was receiving upwards of $1 million a year, and that wasn't including quite a lot of staff salaries that were paid for indirectly by the CIA, or directly by the CIA, but through other funding mechanisms. It was rivaled only by the Soviet Comintern, whose initiatives and tactics it was intended to counteract and inevitably ended up mirroring to some degree. But I find that comparison a little bit misleading, insofar as whilst the two sides were peering over the fence at each other and wondering how to outwit each other, there was another dynamic and energy fueling this. And it was Mary McCarthy's biographer who put it to me that the CCF, the Congress of Cultural Freedom, was focusing its efforts much closer to home. She said, who was the real antagonist? It wasn't the Soviet Union or Moscow. What they were really obsessed with was Sartre and du Beauvoir. That was the other side. And indeed, in London, while the Soviet Union's double agents were sashaying freely through the corridors of power, British intelligence was fretting about the New Statesman. That was the other side. Muybridge famously said that its great success as a propagandist has been to establish the proposition that to be intelligent is to be left, whereas almost the exact opposite is true. It was this worrying ideological deficit that the CIA operation was designed to correct. So the CCF was the CIA's publishing house. It produced scores of books, journals of considerable merit, published and read throughout the world. It was also the agency's impresario in matter of organising conferences, seminars, musical prizes, art exhibitions, architectural competitions. It was also the cover for many CIA agents. By many, I mean enough to populate a small country. They were all over it like a rash. And by agents, I mean CIA employees. I mean people who were paid by, received a pension from, took annual reviews with, understood coded messages, how to open the bottom of a false briefcase bottle with, and most likely in the end were awarded service medals, secret service medals in such unlikely clandestine situations or locations as a houseboat or a sail in one case. Many others were one degree out beyond that, which was witting. In other words, they were not CIA employees, but they were friendly to the project. They'd been brought in CIA parlance to be witting was to know and to sign up, literally, to sign an oath, to keep the secret. Encounter, as we know, was funded and managed both by CIA, I would say, in the lead role, and MI6. It was kind of casual in the end, how a lot of these things were agreed. There was a lunch in May 1952 at the RAC Club, and the CIA met with the MI6 counterparts and discussed how they would piggyback dollars to the magazine, how its editorial content would be monitored, guided, and in extremis controlled, and who would edit it, of course. These decisions were taken at that level. The early funding was, Britain supplied a small amount of funding which covered Stephen Spender's salary for the most part, and this was funneled through cheques that were signed by Alexander Korda, the film director, and Victor Rothschild, both of whom were winning fronts for MI6. There were also brown envelopes, I think, floating around at the beginning, which were handled by Margot Walmsley, who was the front of house, sort of concierge, if you like, and the office manager, who was supplied by the Foreign Office, although her cover was kept, I think, for a very long time. I'm very interested in what Matthew's been saying about the change, if you like, between Stephen his approach to Horizon and then Encounter. I think it's absolutely true that he was very aware that Europe, having become suspicious and bored of propaganda, was not going to accept or acquiesce a magazine that looked as if it were openly propagandizing or were supported by government of whichever kind. And he wrote, very importantly, he wrote early on in his editorship, he wrote to Michael Josselson, who was the CIA man in Paris, editor-in-chief, executive editor, I suppose, for all of the magazines. He said to him, "We must speak for culture with a capital C if we wish to plead the case for cultural freedom." And Josselson replied, "We are not publishing cultural magazines with a capital C." And I think in this little contretemps over punctuation, the size of that C, big or small, tells you a great deal about the conflicts between Spender and his political editors who came on board, and ultimately the way in which Encounter folded, or was exposed, collapsed, lost its reputation. Spender, from the research I did, I thought was pretty determined, focused, and at times ruthless in his approach to Encounter. His first co-editor was Irving Kristol, New Yorker, Trotskyite, former Trotskyite, much more interested in politics than he was in culture. Spender was very frustrated with the way in which Kristol was sort of cutting up material, and he was campaigning for several years, from 53 until 56, 57, to have him replaced. And eventually Michael Josselson in Paris agreed that this change should happen and a new editor should be appointed. And there's this very strange year, 57 to 58, where Dwight MacDonald appears on the scene. But Kristol is held on to because as soon as Dwight MacDonald's been appointed, there's some hesitation. Michael Josselson, who doesn't make that many strategic or tactical errors, decides that, Dwight MacDonald's a bit of a loose cannon. He's dispatched somewhere, Egypt, I think, to file some copy of Post-Suez. He doesn't get out of bed. I don't think he files any copy at all. It's all a disaster. Anyway, what happens is, Dwight MacDonald goes back to the States and publishes his famous Rant Against America, which was refused it was initially accepted by Encounter, and it was then refused after the Paris office directed that they remove it from the list of articles to be published. So it was fairly controversial and not independent for everybody. And then Melvin Lasky arrived. And Melvin Lasky arrived, I was just thinking about this last night. I was thinking, why didn't Melvin Lasky just come in 57? It would have resolved all. Well, he was the obvious choice. And I missed this when I was writing the book, but I looked up the date and what was going on, and I realised that Melvin Lasky, who was very close to Willy Brandt, and poor Willy Brandt, it has to be remembered, was like a sort of magnet for spies. I mean, every spying outfit in the world was all over him, so it's impossible in the end to distinguish whose man he was. But certainly the CIA had case. Michael Josselson was at one point his case officer. Anyway, Lasky had formed a very close relationship with him, and 57 was the year in which Willy Brandt was campaigning to be elected mayor of Berlin. He won that position, and Lasky was then free to come in 58 to London. And I believe absolutely that it was Lasky's mission, if you like, to do in London what he'd done in England, what he'd done in Germany with Willy Brandt, which was to befriend and get close to the social democrat wing of the British Labour Party, and bring that group into Encounter, use Encounter to give it a platform and a voice, and that in the end this friendship, which developed, a very close friendship, which developed with Hugh Gaitskell and a group around him, Richard Crossman, Rita Hindon, the Fabian Society, Dennis Healy, that Lasky was very, very instrumental in securing a Gaitskellite victory within the Labour Party. He boasted of it as such. Now, I don't think he believed any more than Josselson did that Encounter was a cultural magazine with a capital C. He dismissed a lot of it as Elizabeth Bowen and all that crap. He said that Spender's literary circle was incapable of serious intellectual or political talk at their parties, just malicious, witty gossip. I think the correspondence between Lasky and Josselson in particular shows that their interest in Encounter was, Stephen Spender was very important because he provided this sophisticated grand window dressing, but what they really wanted was a Trojan horse, a way of penetrating the intellectual milieu to gain credence for an apparently disinterested and altruistic mission to shore up cultural freedom against the eroding tides of communism. But as I say, what they really wanted was political penetration. What another researcher in this subject, Giles Scott Smith, has called a radical democratic political offensive. That was the campaign. Lasky, I'm not going to say too much about Lasky because Maren is here, but he does say in Media Warfare, the Americanization of Language, he says, I had participated in Berlin as the editor of Der Monat in a related campaign of revisionism, together with social democrats like Ernst Reuter and Willy Brandt. and that he wanted this campaign to continue in England, an intellectual campaign, he said, to revise the party's old socialist doctrine. Encounter published many articles criticising the statist dogma of the old left, which was committed to a total nationalisation of the economy. Lasky's approach, I think, I'm not sure there's anything that, I think it's an impossible reality to be a former Trotskyite. I think once a Trotskyite, always a Trotskyite. And by that I mean there's a certain sort of frame of mind that's very, very hard to shrug. An attitude, and in psychological terms it seemed to be characterised by a determination to fence and argue and a great deal of cynicism, quite stark cynicism about other people's motives, and a lot of scorn parcelled out, and plus all these sort of internal fights, and a lot of rudeness actually. It was just really, really abrupt. It must have been very hard for Stephen. I think there was a big, big culture shock. This preponderance of New York intellectuals had all come from that, come of age really in City College, New York, and the Trotskyite cells there, what I think is paradoxically a kind of retarded environment, where, as I say, you fight at any cost. There was also this question, the Trotskyite credo, if you like, that it was intellectuals who would provide moral and political leadership in the community, but they had to do so free of any interference from the state. So art, doesn't tolerate orders or intellectual creation, hypocrisy and lies. They should be not policed or authorised or regulated by the state. This I think Lasky truly believed. But it wasn't culture for culture's sake or art for art's sake. He also believed that culture should be a dangerous and subversive adjunct of politics. He talked about an active truth. So I think it was quite distinct from the ideas that Stephen had at that time, and explains quite a lot of the clashes that they had. They slogged it out for the better part of 10 years. And then, of course, as we all know, Encounter was outed in 1967 as a recipient of CIA funding. Spender resigned, Lasky stayed on. Poo said its apologists, who defended the magazine's impeccably independent credentials and derided claims that cultural freedom had been in any way compromised. Tut said its detractors, many of whom had received generous fees to write for it, we always knew there was something fishy about it, they said. And that was that. The axe fell on the cover-up, rather than what one historian described as the sweetheart deal that Western intellectuals enjoyed with the dark angel of American government for nearly 2 decades. Now, one of the principal arguments mounted to defend Encounter is that it was a really good magazine. It was, someone wrote recently actually, it was Charles Moore, the quality of the writing in the magazine, whatever invisible cramps may have been put on it by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, was consistently excellent. Now, I've got a problem with the idea of excellence in this context, insofar as I think it's sort of deployed as sort of value-free, and when you can land a precision bomb on a walnut from 30,000 feet, and that's a form of excellence, but it doesn't, we shouldn't necessarily applaud the fact or the capacity to do it. And if that's too crude, then I would suggest another way of looking at it, which is that Encounter's form of excellence excluded other forms of excellence. The writers of the American South, whose gritty portrayal of racism and epidemic poverty sat at an impossible angle to the official culture, the social realists, or simply the realists, who were passing their work around like Saunders in the age of abstract expressionism, they too were excluded in favour of this great messy experiment which had been laundered rather sketchily into free enterprise art. And there was something else wrong. The symptomatic silences, the acoustic dead spots on Cuba, Vietnam, the Negro problem. It was dripping wet on the subject of McCarthyism. These were prophylactic silences created around sensitive issues and endorsed with the grandeur of the names on the contents page. The scheme worked. It created a cultural climate favourable to its US paymasters, and the cultural side of Encounter secured respectability for what the CIA came affectionately to regard as a house organ. I don't think that I say anywhere in the book that the intellectuals themselves were directly exploited by the CIA. I think it was much more knowing exchange than that. But it was not a question of manipulation, more one of legitimization. A process whereby the ideas of the dominant groups are validated in public discourse and those of subordinate groups are not. But at a price. By trimming its sails to suit the prevailing winds of American diplomacy, it contributed to what Dwight MacDonald called the hush-hush attitude toward all of the fakery and shoddiness that for years has been growing in our so-called intellectual hemisphere. So were they duped? There were certainly many intellectuals associated with Encounter and the Congress who didn't feel particularly affronted when the revelations broke in 1967 about the CIA. I think this perhaps reflects the unusual degree of cooperation and consensus that intellectuals and the intelligence community shared in this period. Spender was appalled and ran hither and thither crying foul, but his protestations won him little support. I do feel genuine sympathy for him, and I think he must have been in a terrible bind at this point. Lasky had absolutely no sympathy at all. He dismissed his resignation as a storm in a teacup. He's really the misfit. He's surrounded by this preponderance of the New York intellectuals: Lasky, Daniel Bell, Irving Kristol, Norman Horowitz, Saul Stein, and others, who were, as I say, spoke this dialect, this Trotsky dialect, and destined all of them to become neoconservatives. I think they were always and only reactionary idealists from the beginning, less enfant terrible than terrible infants. But not Spender. But nor can I buy into him as this, the version of him as a Dostoevskian holy fool, kind of lodestar for mystical escapism. It doesn't sit well for me with the other narrative of him, following quite a well-plotted career for himself in psychological warfare, propaganda during the war, or being associated with propaganda outfits, and then later with all of these CIA outfits. To me, he remains a real puzzle, and I'd be very interested to know a little bit more from this evening about what other people think. Maybe he was just human. Opportunities arrived and he took them. We're all poor, fought creatures. He did write, however, in 1967, after the whole brouhaha, that, I quote, "There should be a form of contract between the foundations and those who receive funds from them, guaranteeing that the funds do actually come from the stated sources," which I think is eminently sensible given the experiences he'd had. However, I could find no evidence that he had asked for such guarantee when he, from the Ford Foundation, when he accepted the editorship of Index on Censorship in 1972. In fact, he basically launched it. He relaunched what had been a Congress for Cultural Freedom magazine called Censorship, which had been one of the victims of the 1967 exposures. And he did this with money from the Ford Foundation. Now, the Ford Foundation was well known. It was covered in the expose as having been a willing, very useful, very important partner to the CIA in the matter of surge funding, putting enormous amounts of money into either CIA money or Ford Foundation money into these projects. It was a trusted subcontractor. It was also a very cosy roost for a lot of retired, or not even retired, CIA agents. It was closely associated with International Pen, which was thoroughly penetrated by the CIA, and again, that was also known. And I don't understand why Spender wouldn't have got a whiff of this at that point. I'm not sure what that's all about. I want to close by saying that another defence for Encounter and the whole of the Cold War is that it helped end the Cold War, that it was part of the victory over the Soviet Union. And the language of this can be quite hubristic. John Sutherland, writing after Lasky's death in 2004, said of Lasky, "He had been lucky enough to live to taste final victory and to spend the evening of his life in Berlin, close to the wall which, a Joshua of our time, he had been instrumental in tumbling down." Now, here's a thought that's been developed quite interestingly by various researchers, but it's this. It's possible that the contest prolonged rather than shortened the Cold War. And Lasky is a very interesting example of the case. He went on editing Encounter until 1991. He ploughed the same old ground, but the caravan had moved on. It was gouty, anachronistic, reeking of the Cold War and that conflict had been exhausted. It was what one New York intellectual might have described as a whiffle bird, a fabulous creature that flies backward in ever-decreasing circles until it flies up its own arsehole and becomes extinct. It's very hard, I think, to renounce former positions. It requires a lot of courage, and I think that one of the problems for Stephen, as for many others involved in this, is that whilst they knew, they sort of didn't know, and they didn't really want to know, and it would have involved too much backtracking and denunciation and washing of dirty linen in public. And I think also that the anti-communist orthodoxy became something of a mental trap. Senator William Fulbright wrote, disavowing the credo, if you like, on which America's role in the Cultural Cold War had been built. He said, our leaders became liberated from the normal rules of evidence and inference when it came to dealing with communism. Our faith liberated us, like the believers of old, from the requirements of empirical thinking. Like medieval theologians, we had a philosophy that explained everything to us in advance, and everything that did not fit could be readily identified as a fraud or a lie or an illusion. The perniciousness of the anti-communist orthodoxy arises not from any patent falsehood, but from its distortion and simplification of reality, from its universalization and its elevation to the status of a revealed truth. And I think that's very insightful, and it pretty much describes the position that I held when I was writing the book and that I came to, and still haven't really shifted from now. I just want to say in closing, I'm enormously grateful to Matthew for asking me to speak here. I admire you for doing that. It's unusual in a literary executor to do anything other than try and hold the status quo. I was given an enormous runaround by all the literary executors that I had to deal with in my book. I mean, I nearly had to sort of call the Samaritans. They were driving me completely bonkers. Which is probably why I turned to the 14th century after this book. So I didn't clear anything for usage or copyright. But I think that history is well served by, not just by the authorized, but also by the unauthorized and by the challenging version. We don't all want to become tame and partial recorders of Camelot. So, with that, thank you, Matthew.
You're welcome. Yes, taking it on the chin, I suppose. With this business about Penn Club, British Council, lots of institutions for which you say penetrated by the CIA or have connections. The puzzling thing is that how secret are cultural matters, or how open are cultural matters? If you imagine the problem of two political entities getting into a total tangle, such as disarmament, or the incredible disaster of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where both the Americans and the Russians asked themselves, was there nobody capable of bringing somebody up in Moscow and saying, he really means it? Why did we get so close to the Third World War without any safety devices? In circumstances such as that, Penn Club, well, a poet goes and he gives a speech. There's absolutely nothing political about the speech. It indicates a certain kind of friendliness. It doesn't have to do more. It doesn't have to be covered for some kind of secret information which might change the fate of the world or something like that. It seems to me that when it comes to cultural wars, you're dealing with a slightly nebulous. It can't be equated with something as basic as betraying an atomic secret or a battle plan. It seems to me the distinction between military intelligence and cultural intelligence is huge. Therefore, let's hear from Maren about Lasky. It's possible that she has a lot more that we haven't heard.
Thank you for having me. Turns out that Lasky is a very controversial figure, and the interesting thing is despite the fact that a lot is known and written about him in terms of his CIA role, You don't hear me?
No, we can't hear you.
I don't know.
I don't know if any of these are on, are they on?
They don't work.
Okay, okay, I'll try. He's a controversial figure, and people who write about him concentrate on this controversial role in terms of the CIA scandal. But actually, there's just one article written on him, that covers more than just that period that is so known. And so the good thing is that we have his papers now at Munich University. You mentioned that already. And so for the first time, I have the privilege, so to say, to look at his life before he came to Europe. He was born in New York on January 15th, 1920. The son of Polish Jews who had immigrated a lot in Poland to New York around the turn of the century. And he lived in the Bronx, as many other immigrated Jews were. And he was growing up in the 1920s and 30s, and it is important to look at what his family was like. I mean, how he was influenced by his family, because already to jump ahead a bit, it's maybe a bit easy to now only focus on the CIA scandal and see him as someone who, how to put it, I mean, who was how should I put that? It's important for me to look at his early period to understand who he was when he came to Berlin in the 40s, to gain that role and to see what he was interested in, what he was planning to do in his life, and not become a CIA agent as people claim that he eventually did, which I'm saying he didn't. But let me come back to that later. Let's start with the beginning and have him grow up in the 20s and 30s in the Bronx, in Depression era America. And the roles in his family, there were three certain values in his family that were very important and that influenced his life. The first role was a central role of reading newspapers. The media was always very important. Secondly, there were very heated political discussions. I think that's important to mention. Parts of his family were all leaning to the left, so they were having Sunday lunch fights on various issues, also talking about Germany and what was happening in Europe. And the third thing that I wanted to mention is that the family held German language and German culture in high esteem. The family would have German literature in the original in their library, and his father would read those books, and so he was pretty. So German culture was pretty present when Lasky grew up in New York. So those early influences on his and the intellectual stimulation, as well as the important his parents would attach to it, education and social advancement, suited his character and interests very well, actually. He was curious, eager for knowledge, and very ambitious. And he was, from early on, and I guess that's important for his later life, fascinated by books and people alike. I mean, he always was interested in reading, but he always was also interested in meeting people. And that's very important in terms of his networking capabilities, and I guess I actually see him as a major networking person. So he was interested in many things: history, politics, literature, theater, classical music, movies, and sports. And when you take a look at his diaries, which I read, he spent a lot of time reading American literature, European literature, all the classics, contemporary books. And he was ambitious even in that, because at some point he write like, must read like a machine. So he was like, I need to read and read and read everything that's there. He was a good student, and what was pretty normal in these days for a boy from a Jewish family was to go to City College, which is a university, tuition-free university in New York. It's also called the Jewish Harvard. You might be aware that some universities, or many universities, were having quotas for Jews at that time in America, but City College was, I think, it wasn't just Jewish boys, but maybe mainly. So in those 4 years at City College, he not only got his BSS, but also actively participated in those famous debates. You might have heard about those alcoves 1 and 2, little niches in the cafeteria where Stalinists and anti-Stalinists would fight in half-heated discussions. And that's where he also was friends with Daniel Bell, the famous sociologist, Irving Kristol, and all those people we already talked about here. Those that eventually were known as the New York Jewish intellectuals. So he was a Trotskyist. Well, actually, I talked to Daniel Bell, and he said Mel never was a Trotskyist. So I think there's discussions already about that. But what Daniel Bell told me, and I think that's an interesting argument for me to make also at a later point, is he said the thing about Mel, he had a streak of independence. He never wanted to join anything. He wanted to have Laskyites. So maybe, you know, he was never a member of any Trotskyist party. He was reading the magazines, and he had some kind of missionary zeal, also later in Michigan, where he studied history, to turn around Stalinists, fellow students. But he was never a member of any party. As I said, in that atmosphere, he got acquainted with those New York Jewish intellectuals, and he was invited to their parties. In general, when you take a look at the diaries, you'd have a feeling of parties all over. It's reading and parties mainly, and studying, of course. But that's, you know, the networking aspect. You know, the reading, the intellectual, and then the parties and networking and having fun. He already started to write reviews in the late 30s for Partisan Review, which was the organ of the anti-Stalinist left. He also tried to write little reviews for other kinds of papers. He would always send papers, reviews in, and be delighted when they were published. And Dwight MacDonald played a very important role. At that time, he was editor of Partisan Review, and he became a role model and mentor to Lasky. So to him, he would write those, and that's a very important source because I have those diaries, but I have long letters by Lasky where he would write, first of all, you know, in America, but then later in Germany, write back and write about how, you know, how he felt and what he was doing and what he was aiming for, and that's, for me, a very important source because it's not just jotted down, but it's, you know, whole sentences. He went to Michigan to get his MA in history, and when he returned, he enrolled in Columbia as a PhD student, and I'm pretty convinced that he wanted to be a professor or he wanted to teach. But then what happened was that he had, financial reasons, he had to get a job, and funnily enough, he worked for a year at the Statue of Liberty as a guide, showing people, you know, the way, you know, up. And the drawback of this job was that he had this work routine where he had to work every day and he couldn't do what he wanted to do. And that's doing research, writing, and here I'm quoting, having the dream of publishing his own cultural review. And I think that's important because, I mean, here we have someone who wants to write, who wants to think, who wants to do research, and he wants to be an editor. So this whole issue of being an editor goes way back. It's not just something that he does because it's a good cover for being an agent. You know what I'm saying? So in 1942, Daniel Bell saves him, as he told me, I saved Mel from the Statue of Liberty because he gets a job at the New Leader, a Social Democratic weekly. And actually it does save him because this is the first time he can actually be a journalist and write and work as a journalist. Here we also have this whole question that I've been trying, you know, to find out more about, but it's not, I haven't, you know, succeeded so far totally. The question of when he broke. I mean, every one of those Trotskyists at some point breaks. And you have him as a missionary in Ann Arbor, trying to bring around Stalinist fellow travelers. But then he gradually, in the late 30s, disassociates himself. For example, in August 39, shortly after the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Soviet Union, he soberly writes in his diary, "If nothing else turns up, I really think that socialism is through for our time, even intellectually." So he's starting to have doubts. And in the early 40s, he was still a supporter of the Socialist Workers' Party, but the entry of the war, of America into the war, I guess that's the point where it's actually over. And then I have him write a letter later where he says, "As something of a social democrat, I joined Danny Bell at the new leader." So I think at that stage, he already has turned around totally. He just stays there for a year because he's drafted, and he's being trained throughout the U.S. Until he goes overseas to Germany, to France and to Germany. And before I talk about his work in Berlin, my resume on his life in New York is twofold. I mean, the one thing would be the networking. I think that's a major thing that he, throughout his life in New York, he would always try to actively meet people, meet famous people, meet intellectuals, meet writers, meet fellow, students. He was forming a network of contacts, and he would expand that network later to Berlin, but always go back. And then he would expand it to London, and he would always go back. And I think that's one of the major features that you have to take into account. And the other thing, as regards to his character, when you look at him in New York before he leaves for Berlin, he appears to have been a socially very active and caring person, hardworking, knowledgeable, keen to debate and outspoken, and of an independent mind. Remember he wanted Laskyite's quote. But at the same time, he seems to have been very sure of himself, dominating, opinionated, and incredibly ambitious. In terms of what he wanted to become, we have those two tracks, and we have the journalism, and we have him wanting to be an historian. He actually, of course, we know that he became a journalist, but he never left his love or his interest for history behind. I mean, you always have it in his writing and in his letters. I mean, he always is interested in history. He comes to Berlin. Well, actually, he enters France and Germany as a combat historian. And then the question arises, why did he stay in Berlin after the war? He was demobilized in July 46, and he couldn't just stay in Berlin as an American because you wanted to stay in Berlin. You needed to have a reason or a permission. And I think he stayed for two reasons. The first one would be a private reason. He fell in love with his later wife. And the second one would be a professional reason. He became the German correspondent for the Partisan Review and the New Leader, but I think he became that because he was fascinated by the city. I mean, Berlin, I guess, was the city to be at that point because things were happening in Berlin. And he really wanted to stay and see what was happening firsthand. So he was doing his job as a correspondent, and his first public appearance, so to say, took place in October 47 at the first German Writers' Congress, where he held a speech and challenged the Soviets. And by that, he gained overnight notoriety, and his name was in the papers. Apparently, General Clay had wanted to expel him from Berlin. At least that's what Lasky writes in his memoir. But funnily enough, about a half year later, he gets a job with the American military government, and becomes a cultural officer. and receives permission to found a cultural review, which is called Der Monat. I don't know who has heard of that review. Eventually became one of the best intellectual journals in post-war Germany, but it was officially sponsored by the American military government. It did say that because we're talking about sponsorship. I mentioned that. The goal of Der Monat, and I think this is one thing I wanted to mention when we talk about the whole involvement of the CIA. Founding the Monat was just part of a whole policy of the American military government, or government in general, for the re-education of Germany after the Second World War. So when we have the funding of various cultural projects, not just the Congress for Cultural Freedom or the Monat, we have the view that Germany needs to be re-educated, needs to be made democratic, and this view was taken also by, every occupying power had their own re-education program. Of course, the Soviets thought that re-education was a different thing, from what the British or the Americans thought. But in general, this whole policy of re-education covers Amerika-Häuser, sending teachers to America to get trained, having a different school system, publishing newspapers, supporting, like the Monat. And so the thing of winning the hearts and minds, this should be seen in a bigger perspective. So it's not just, it's like in a war of ideas, you need to win people over, but after what had happened in Germany, you need to make the country and youth. It was also mainly focused on youth. Make them democratic, and this was. It wasn't really successful in some parts, in some programs, but the Monats, and that's what people are saying, is one of the major successes. Of course, anti-communism joined re-education as, it was both. It was re-education and then also anti-communism. But it was mainly, of course, countering the Soviets with cultural propaganda. So, of course, the Monat had this impetus, but on the other hand, why the Monat became so popular was that what Lasky did was publish authors and writers who had either been banned in Germany before or who weren't known yet. So that's why even until today, his name is has a positive ring when it comes to Monat. If it's Günter Grass or other people, they would always say that he as the editor of the Monat played such an important role in bringing back literature to Germany after the war. So maybe that's also something where it cannot be compared with Encounter. And also it was not funded by the CIA in the beginning. It was funded by the military government and later by the Ford Foundation, and just in the late 50s became part of the Congress, actually. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, I'm not going to talk about a lot. It's just that important to say that Lasky was a co-founder and a general secretary of the original Congress in Berlin. Just later, it was decided that this whole should be an institution that was to be based in Paris. In a letter he later wrote to Dwight MacDonald, Lasky says this: the whole Congress to him was a one-shot affair. I don't really believe this, but the thing is that the CIA wanted. The only thing I got from the CIA when I asked for information on Melvin Lasky was this one document. And this one document says that Lasky needed to be removed from the Congress because of his affiliation with the American government as a cultural officer. That's the reason. Because De Wisner, who was the boss at that point in Washington, he thought that he was too openly connected with the American military government. That's why they didn't want him to be part of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. He stayed in Berlin until 1958, until he left for London. What should I say about life in Berlin? I mean, I think ideologically, as a journalist, he was in line with the American at that point. I mean, I think we're not disputing that. He had a very busy social life, and here I'm coming again back to that issue of networking. I mean, if you look at, I just said this afternoon to Matthew, I mean, when you look at his notebook or calendar from the 1950s, he would jot down, like, I had lunch with, or I read this, or I got a letter from this person. You look at that page for the day, and it's like, that's just 24 hours. I don't know, does he sleep? I mean, you know, it's like, so he was really active and busy, working on the magazine, meeting people, and of course, again, the networking. I mean, when people would write from New York, he would have all these contacts, he would travel, and yes, he was close to the Social Democrats in Germany. I'm not sure that the reason he didn't go to Encounter in 57 was because of Brandt. As far as I know, the family didn't really want to leave Berlin. They liked it there. On the other hand, I think that London was attractive because Berlin wasn't as attractive anymore as it had been in 45. And then, of course, he could work in his own language. I think this was one of the major reasons also. And I'm not sure, I mean, I think in your book you also write that he was asked in 53 to start the magazine. I have no evidence of that, but you know, maybe I haven't seen all of it, all the sources. But to me, I think it's mainly the fact that London was more interested in 1958. I mean, more interesting than London, than Berlin. Because Berlin, I think I have that even in some sources, became boring in a way. Then he came to London in 1958 with his family. Encounter at that time already had become one of the leading European intellectual journals. He succeeded Irving Kristol, whom he had known from City College. They have debated now for one. And I think he explicitly came as a political editor. I think that's sort of their job description, political editor and literary editor. And, you know, no matter, I mean, you talk about excellence and you were so critical, but I mean, at least from what I've heard from many people I interviewed and from the sources and also from Stephen Spender, that he was brilliant as an editor. I mean, everyone agrees on that. The question is if you can have an excellent magazine under those conditions. I would still think that you can, and I don't think you can say that because of the funding you should discredit. It's like discrediting in a way the work. The relationship to Spender, we have quite a few letters in the papers between Stephen Spender and Lasky. Interestingly enough, Spender even already appears in the diary, in the early 1930s diary, so he was aware of the writings, and he even printed a review in the New Leader, I think, so there is already some kind of contact in a way. I believe that part of the differences, the difficulties arose from those fundamental cultural differences between Spender and Lasky, and also generational. Because I guess what happened is, you know, like having Stephen Spender as the British editor, you had a figure that was so very known in Britain, but I think like both Kristol and Lasky were pretty unknown in Britain. So you had those differences between the New York Jewish ex-Trotskyist and then the British and a person like Stephen Spender. So, and also you had a different generation. The divisional work was officially there, but I think they never really talked it out. That's the impression I get. There's a lot of talk about no cooperation. I mean, Spender complains a lot about Lasky not cooperating, but always complaining about having to work too much. But then Spender says, but we never talk about it. So I think they had maybe it was also because Stephen Spender was away often. I mean, he would go, sometimes for half a year, he would go to America for teaching assignments. So there's a lot of problems way before the scandal breaks. So Spender would accuse Lasky of planning things behind his back, not cooperating, for using him just as a contact to big names. He accuses him of not treating authors very well. So there's a lot of conflict that you see in those letters that are dating already from the early 60s. Unfortunately, I don't have too many replies from Lasky. In the papers, you always have the letters that he gets and not the ones that he writes. But so one thing he says is that, of course, I do all the work because Stephen Spender is not here, and I do all the work, and I'm not plotting behind your back. It's just that you're not there for me to talk to you about it. So I think it's always a matter of perspective. I don't think.
I feel you've never, despite the best will on both sides, worked out a proper working arrangement for the editing of the magazine. That's a covering letter about an article by Robert Oppenheimer, which Spender wanted to publish and Lasky did not want to publish. Oppenheimer being a very important figure at the time, since he was a minority voice. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem. But I have many of those incidences. So about life in London in general. I mean, we have his work as an editor. Apparently overworked. He was traveling a lot. He was writing articles and books. Again, he was networking. Again, he was reaching out, and again, he was, as Francis already said, he was reaching out to that Gateskill faction. And I don't know. Maybe maybe I just don't want to see it. I don't know, but I don't really see a plot in a way. I mean, I don't see him having to do that because the CCF is forcing him to do it. I always think that he did the things he was interested in. I mean, you do see a line between him wanting to be close to Reuter and wanting to be close to Gateskill because that's the views he shared. I mean, so I don't really see a plot. So the problem, I guess, he had, from what I heard, is that social life in Berlin was different from social life in London. I'll be right back. One quote I have that's very interesting is in Berlin people loved him, and in London they respected him at best. I mean, I don't know if that's what someone told me. So he just one thing I can end with is the question with the CIA. Everyone seems to be so interested in that. I don't agree with what Wilfred writes, that Lasky was a winning CIA agent. It's because I can't, even if I wanted to say that, I couldn't prove it, and I want to stick to my sources and just, say what I actually saw or heard. I'm pretty sure that he knew from the start where the money came from already in 1950 with the original Congress. But as stubborn and controversial as Lasky behaved when the CIA connections with the Congress was finally disclosed in 1966-67, knowing what I know now about his background and personality, especially about his firm convictions and his dominant and independent nature that went against any kind of instrumentalization, I'm strongly convinced that Lasky throughout his life did what he himself believed in. His liberal anti-communist views, as Hugh Wilfred aptly put it, simply merged easily with that of state-sponsored defenders of Western intellectual freedom.
Thank you very much. Jason, how do you feel about the editorial policy? Who make the decisions and how do they come about?
That's an extremely complex question. I can't give you a straightforward soundbite answer to that, I'm afraid. I don't know how you wanted to... I wondered how we're doing for time. Yeah. Well, I mean, I plan to come and talk this evening about the contents of the magazine, and if we could make some judgments there about the relative portions of the magazine and how editorial disagreements resolve themselves in the contents of the magazine. So would you like me to present my paper now? And I'll do my best to abbreviate it so we have some time for questions. I suppose I wanted to go slightly against the grain of received opinion with Encounter. And I wanted to sort of suggest at the beginning and try to demonstrate this by looking at a test case of the contents, which is this volume, Encounters, which is a selection of articles that appeared in the first decade of the journal. That we can exaggerate, perhaps, the degree to which the magazine was a Cold War magazine and producing propaganda for the American government and the CIA. I think we can also exaggerate the extent to which the editorial policy for this magazine, its constraints, is completely different from any other magazine, where it has a policy, it has a character, it has disagreements about the sort of material that it publishes. And I also wanted to suggest that this characterization of this dysfunctional editorial non-collaboration between both Irving Kristol and Stephen Spender, and then later between Melvin Lasky and Stephen Spender, actually throws off the scent a little bit, and that they often produced what I think was the leading cultural magazine of the 1950s and 1960s, and that it was a great success. So these are the points that I wanted to bring out. I wanted to talk very briefly about the editorial backstory to how this anthology came to be produced. I wanted to guide you a sort of whistle-stop tour through the contents and try and characterize what I think it represents. And then I wanted to conclude very briefly with some conclusions about the controversy over the reviews, the reception of this anthology. Just one letter from 1961, Stephen Spender to Michael Josselson, who was the orchestrator of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Spender writes, "When I first discovered, quite accidentally, that a paperback anthology of Encounter was being edited by Mel and Irving without my being asked, I was so amazed that I did not know what to think. I asked Stuart Hampshire what he thought. He roared with laughter and said he thought it absolutely incredible behaviour on the part of my colleagues. There are certain ways of behaving towards colleagues which Mel does not seem to have heard about." And I think it's important to get this sense of how Lasky was independent-minded, he was his own man, he had a clear vision for the journal, but also perhaps to complicate notions of the balance of power between the political and the literary cultural sides. Lasky was obviously a very resourceful editor, I mean, everybody says that. So on the one side we have this idea of Lasky as the editorial dictator determining the contents, the literary politico, where Stephen Spender, as Natasha Spender wrote, was easily bamboozable. He was so innocent, he was so naive. Well, I would say four things about the contents, and I think you have them on your handout. I would invite you to reflect upon these 4 points about the contents. One, there are a lot of friends and associates of Stephen Spender in the anthology. Two, it's overwhelmingly cultural. The majority are literary and arts essays, pieces. Very little is straightforwardly political, let alone anti-communist. Three, the majority of contributors are British rather than American, a ratio of 3 to 2. And finally, twice as many of the pieces included in the anthology come from the 5 years of Kristol's co-editorship with Spender rather than Lasky's. And this might be important because if we're told, as Frances Stone Saunders concludes in her book, in all cases Encounter was resolutely ideological, an integer of anti-communist thinking, and that this was being orchestrated by the CIA through the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It's interesting that in this 1963 anthology, the majority of pieces come from Kristol's so-called maverick editorial control, when he was resolutely not, he wasn't doing what Josselson wanted to do. So I'll turn to the contents now, and I'll try and say that if you look at the contents, it's very hard to see this as a distillation of the great battle against the Soviet Union, which toppled it. And I'm sceptical that actually most readers who bought Encounter or who were interested in this anthology saw it in purely those terms. The first section is persons and places. It's readable, it's entertaining, there's a lot of humour there. Laurie Lee on the Cannes Film Festival, Kenneth Tynan on Spanish bullfighting, Robert Graves on uncanny coincidences. If there are two pieces there with political speculations, I think they're with a very light touch. The one piece which is anti-communist is by Maren McCarthy. It's her reasons for her retreat from communist intellectuals. And she says, I joined the anti-communist movement without meaning to, as if she sort of fell into this role. So it's hardly a principled, provocative stance. So this is how the volume opens. There's more teeth in the second section, and I think this is revealing about the editorial balance of the magazine. Problems and Polemics starts with Hugh Trevor-Roper's devastating piece on Arnold Toynbee's Millennium, in which he likens him with rather remarkable rudeness and sarcasm to a combination of the Messiah and Adolf Hitler. It's a devastating piece. And Toynbee is scolded for his surrender and fascination with power. I think this theme continues through this polemical section. In a more playful, albeit mischievous way, Nancy Mitford's celebrated article on the English aristocracy, which outlined the shibboleths of the English snob system, which famously divides people who wear napkins at luncheon from people who wear serviettes at dinner time. And Stephen Spender said that this article put Encounter on its feet. Again, it's hardly a rabidly anti-communist piece. And it received a characteristically acerbic response from Evelyn Waugh, who delivered the immortal line about Ralph Butler's Education Act, that it was making provision for the free distribution of university degrees to the deserving poor. Now, the serious point to think about this exchange is that it says something about a post-war anxiety about leadership in post-war Britain and the welfare state. Who were the proper leaders? And there's also a great anxiety projected from American views of Britain's stance against the Soviet Union that there's a moribund establishment, that it isn't doing its job properly. So Ed Schill's article on the British intellectuals says that they're too cosy. The intellectuals in Britain are too cosy with the establishment. They go to the same schools, they go to Oxbridge, they're not radical enough, they don't question the system, therefore it's allowed to stagnate. And I think the most telling and the most trenchant controversy that surrounds this polemical section is C.P. Snow's Two Cultures lecture. The 1959 Reed lecture was originally published in Encounter, produced a flurry of responses in various magazines, including New Statesman. And in this Afterthoughts, Snow restates what he really wanted to happen in that lecture. He wanted to change educational policy in the UK, and he wanted there to be more scientists, more technologically trained university students, and fewer literary intellectuals who, they don't have the future in their bones. We need to move forward. We need to engage with the Soviet Union. And here is the Cold War slant. And again, it's not anti-communist. He's saying science is a great model of cooperation and learning. This isn't about the arms race. This isn't about building the atom bomb, the H-bomb. This is an element of cooperation. So if I wanted to characterize the teeth of that polemical section, I think it's hard to reduce it to a straightforward instrument of American foreign policy. I think it's something to do with an anxiety, especially acute post-Suez, about a Malay or a Roth in the British establishment, and how this manifests itself in educational policy. I also want to concentrate very briefly on the Men of Ideas section, because I think that's crucial to how we reflect Encounter's role in the Cold War. And I wanted to say that it's a wonderful lineup of leading intellectuals at the time. And I think it's principled without being reductively programmatic. So, for example, there's a key phrase in Irving Kristol's contribution which talks about how intellectuals are complacent to all human intentions. And I think each of these essays in this series make a case for what Lionel Trilling called the liberal imagination. And by that, he characterises it as variousness, possibility, complexity, difficulty. These are the things that flourish in a liberal democracy. And these are the things that are constrained in a totalitarian regime. And so, for example, Berlin talks about his essay on Herzen, the strong tradition of libertarian humanism in Russia that he establishes. The essay on Montaigne celebrates the deeply liberal spirit of tolerance. West, on his father H.G. Wells, talks about how Wells's fiction gives us dystopian nightmares of rational play which crushes the individual. And Wittgenstein's aphorism is quoted, "Everything lies open to inspection." So if I were to characterise in this distilled form from this anthology what the ideological position of Encounter was, I would say something to do, and I think we can exaggerate how it wasn't a free forum and completely open to debate, in which no journal ever is, really. There are editorial limits of sympathies and constraints upon what the editors agree are the characteristics. But I would say to me that what I found subtle and powerful and persuasive, and these are wonderful writers, Lionel Trilling, Isaiah Berlin, is this defence of liberal democratic freedoms. The freedom to think independently and to act independently. And if you place that back in its historical context, you can see the importance of that message. And I think it's not reductive, and I think it's very subtly and powerfully made. The arts and letters section, very quickly, there's a defence of American popular culture there, which I think was combating European anti-Americanism, the defence of the gangster movie, of comics, and this definitely was part of the winning hearts and minds to talk about the re-education of Germany after the war. Well, moving away from the Hitler Youth and towards an adolescence of leisure and reading magazines and jukeboxes. That was part of the battle for hearts and minds. You can see that as malign or benign, according to what you think of American popular culture. But finally, I'll just close with a couple of brief remarks on the outstanding creative writing and literary side of the magazine, which often gets obscured and neglected. And here I think that the credit goes to Stephen Spender rather than Melvin Lasky, who we've heard. I don't know if it's a true remark. It's a reported remark, isn't it? That he referred to Elizabeth Bowen and all that crap.
I don't think so. I'd have to look it up. I think it's meticulously footnoted.
Well, I would just say that I think the stories are not the strong points of Encounter. And there are pieces, if this is the best of 10 years, it's not particularly good. There are stories by Edmund Wilson and Cyril Connolly who are better known as critics, and I think rightly so. And it doesn't really measure up, I think, to even the first year of the London magazine. But the poetry is an outstanding and very eclectic range of writers, from people who made their reputation in the 30s, Auden Spender, McNeice, William Plumer. There's a posthumous piece by Dylan Thomas, Vernon Watkin. American poetry, Robert Lowell, Everhart, Dickie Merwin. Even the movement, there was a mutual antagonism between Spender and this younger generation, but they're there. Amos Larkin, Elizabeth Jennings, Tom Gunn. And also complete poets who it's impossible to categorise. Robert Graves, Edwin Muir, R.S. Thomas, Alan Ross, Ted Hughes. So again, if we feel that this was orchestrated somehow by Josselson in Paris directing The Great Game, I just find that it doesn't mesh with the reception and the success of this magazine in London as a serious intellectual journal, whatever the clandestine routes of funding. That it publishes Larkin's Wits and Weddings, Tom Gunn's On the Move, Ted Hughes's Thrashes, and people are not going to it with a great receptivity to cultural propaganda, Cold War propaganda, and that this anthology gives us a great sense of that. It doesn't include the more strident pieces by the New York intellectuals. Just thinking of Sidney Hook and James Burnham. But it does include Isaiah Berlin, Lionel Trilling, Daniel Bell, more moderate and temperate proponents of liberal freedom. And so I think the whole furore over this anthology, it's actually not the 100th issue, it's this anthology which leads Conor Cruise O'Brien to write a review in which he says this is an instrument of US foreign policy. When there is something which is uncomfortable for the Soviet Union, it's promulgated. When there's something uncomfortable for the Americans, it's mitigated. I find that a reduced version of the amorphousness and the interest of this magazine. Other pieces that could have been included in this anthology that weren't: Frank Commode's essays and reviews, Iris Murdoch on Against Dryness, Sol Bellows' stories. Again, I find it hard to reduce this to, in all cases, it was resolutely ideological and integer anti-communist thinking. So I just project this into the discussion that we're going to have. And so my last point is just to reiterate those 2 points, that it's very easy knowing the fascinating and illuminating revelation of CIA and IRD links, but we can exaggerate the dependence of this journal, we can exaggerate its propagandist function, we can exaggerate the degree to which these independent-minded editors, I mean, Crystal and Askew were very independent-minded, very hard to direct. Stephen Spender knew his own mind. And for all the rows and for all the intrigues, I think it's the outstanding cultural periodical of the 50s and 60s.
Thank you very much. Well, since we're going to be pushing our time a little, I'll plunge straight in and be as succinct as I can. Matthew, in his introduction, quoted from several of the MI5 documents that I've been working on. So in some ways, the cat's out of the bag in terms of what was quoted, but also I hope to clarify some things that I think were still not clear from that particular introduction. So I'm going to, since I'll try and keep this as short as possible, I'll skim over the top of some of the issues, but that's a necessary thing at this stage of events. Now, it appears to me Spender's MI5 file has many pages, lots of interesting material. My favourite was when, after the Cambridge spy defection, special branch officers surveilling one of the Spender residences were writing reports to MI5 about a nocturnal cross-dresser that was emerging from the basement every night, and they could hear a typewriter during the day, and they were very concerned to work out who this person was. You know, there's all sorts of stuff like that that is sitting there well. In terms of what we're actually talking about here tonight, I think there's 2 main trajectories that come out of it. One, Spender was on the inside of the intelligence/propaganda community in the Second World War, and he sort of skirts and denies what he was actually doing in his journals. But I think the MI5 file clearly shows that this, he says at one point, there was nothing secret in the Second World War work. Clearly there was something very secret in the Second World War work. So this answers the question that has lingered over Encounter: what was Spender doing on the editorial board of something, or editing something that had all these other intelligence links? He seemed like the one person that didn't have this history prior, but I think we can fairly much clarify that, although as Jess has just said, how much does this actually matter to our understanding of Encounter, even if this piece of the puzzle is slotted in. Second, though, the interesting thing to come out is even when Spender was editing Encounter, even when his salary was being funded through the IRD, SAS and the CIA, other branches of the British secret state, such as MI5 and Special Branch, were still writing reports on Spender as potential communist and even intercepting telegrams coming into the Encounter office. So this really opens up how complicated this anti-communist fight had become at this point. That the battle lines were not clear, even those in the midst of it didn't know whose side they were on in this way. So I'll back up and I'll provide some more details for what I've just reiterated. Very briefly, peripheral MI5 attention on Stephen Spender seemed to start in 1934. The first few documents are redacted, so we can't really work out what exactly sparked things. Interest really started when they, going into the Daily Worker office, there was a money order for £1 with a note attached to it saying for the Daily Worker, and wasn't signed. I guess the person sending it thought they were being very cunning, but on the letterhead actually had the address of
No, but There's a comment on the margin saying...
It's not his.
Oh, right,
That's, so it had the Spender address on it, but then they said that the handwriting was not Spender's. But this flagged the name Spender, the address Spender, as something that had been linked with his network of surveillance, that next time anything came up in there, that they had traces as they...
It was Tony. It was Tony nicking a quid from Dad, putting it in an envelope.
So this was sitting in the file, and then when further attention was claimed, such as when Spender actually announced, published in the Daily Worker, I joined the Communist Party, and when information was reaching them about the fact that he was over in Spain on a mission from it was actually the Soviet embassy, the front was that he was supposed to be reporting for the Daily Worker, but the actual request, as I think he clarified, was from the Russian embassy had asked him to do this trip. So that was even more worrying to them. It wasn't just the British Communist Party that was asking him to do this. He was a contact.
Up till now, as far as we know, his communism has not been more than theoretical. It may be necessary to keep a sharper eye on him in the future.
Yes. So this is where the ambiguity, and as I was going to point out, that when they actually investigated it, and further intercepts showed that he fell out with the Communist Party almost as soon as he fell into the Communist Party. They decided they switched off from, Cecil Day Lewis had his actual post intercepted for a period, John Lehman had all his posts intercepted for a period. There were active sort of surveillance over many of the others in the circle. Spender himself was sort of fairly hands-off. When he was mentioned in these networks, they put it in his file, but they didn't seem to take too many active investigations, and Special Branch listed him in the category of being, quote, a supporter of communistic theory, end quote, a very convoluted category. They didn't say he was a party member outright. So he was never blacklisted or anything like that. And with the outbreak of the Second World War and the demand for these for professionals needed for government agencies of all sort of stripes, whether white, black, or any shade in between, Spender, I think, found that his skills were sufficient that these previous sort of slightly dodgy traces in his past could be overlooked because he would find champions in the British secret state that were saying, yes, he was a bit pink in the 1930s, but he's over that now, and we need him to do the following jobs. So the first instance, really, in terms of the MI5 file of this change in perception was in 1941 when the Ministry of Information approached the Foreign Office concerning the suitability of Spender and Cyril Connolly for a trip to Ireland to address the Trinity College Dublin Historical Society. The Foreign Office saw this trip as, quote, an excellent opportunity at the present time to get our views publicised in Ireland and one that should not be missed, end quote. So in light of this strong Foreign Office support and the lack of anything concrete in this file, MI5 vetting officers assessed that, quote, there is no doubt that he is no longer sympathetic to the Communist Party. I think we should not object to him. So this wasn't a clandestine trip. This was a very overt public trip, nothing spooky at all in there. But it was one of these points where he had now a reputation as having a supporter in the Foreign Office. MI5 had come to an assessment that it was, okay, we looked at his past, he seems all right now, he can go on to do this work. So this activity, I think, set up the period in 1944 that I think is the crucial marking point. In his journals published in 1985, he described this period as follows. In late 1944, I was transferred from the National Fire Service to the Foreign Office, though that seems a rather grand name for a subsidiary branch of political intelligence situated at Bush House in the Aldwych. We were compiling information about the history of Italian fascism as background material for the British forces occupying Italy. Nothing secret. And biographers have followed from his claims here of saying, yes, he worked in the political intelligence department of the Foreign Office, and this was not particularly secret work. Now, there are several strands to this story that I think are important to pick over and work out what the hell was actually going on here. For one, Bush House was also an address link with the political warfare executive to coordinate the BBC broadcasts. As Matthew said, political warfare executive was the black propaganda agency during the Second World War. It was split off from the special operations executive about halfway through the war into a separate entity. It was in charge of things like setting up fake radio stations, writing disinformation leaflets that were then airdropped into enemy countries, as well as coordinating BBC broadcasts into enemy territories. Into Allied and neutral territories was the Ministry of Information, that was all overt and on the books. Into foreign territories, this was the territory of the political warfare executive, and thus they didn't want it necessarily linked back to it. So it was, PWE was a clandestine agency and went to considerable lengths to hide itself, and this is where the confusion comes in. As one previous member described it, it communicated with the outside world on the notepaper of the political intelligence department. There was an actual political intelligence department. It was a small, I think, place where superannuated Foreign Office officials were put. But like a hermit crab, the political warfare executive picked up the name of the political intelligence department, occupied it, and communicated with the outside world there. But it's quite clear, former members have said that all the communication of the political warfare executive was on political information department letterheads. So, considerable efforts there to sort of hide the political warfare executive from prying eyes. And then this is, the final piece is in the MI5 file, where it's as was mentioned, he was vetted in November 1943 for the political warfare executive over the suitability for him for potential employment, and MI5 again assessed there is no security objection to his employment by the political warfare executive in the continent. He was cleared, and then the note on his form says employed 2nd of the 8th, 1944, the same date in late 1944, where he said, I started my work in the political intelligence department, nothing secret. So I think we've got now fairly conclusive evidence that Spender was employed for a year at least in the political warfare executive, because there are further trips to the continent that occurred where he mentions in his journals that he was in a car provided by the political information department, which is what the political warfare executive came out with the open and operated as in the late stages of the war when the secrecy wasn't needed. And he also mentions meeting people like Richard Crossman, old friend, also happened to be in charge of the German section of the political warfare executive, and also happened to meet Serafin Delva during these trips, who was also happened to be in charge of the clandestine broadcasts into Europe. So you can start seeing these names mentioned and then linking them up to this history and saying, okay, there was something going on here, there was a pattern. This continued after the war. His file has various vetting requests for quite legitimate and open tours, such as being a consultant for UNESCO, various British Council tours, various lecture tours. As I said, nothing secret there, but we could see that this was all part of this network that was sort of not, they weren't told what to say, but they were vetted by MI5, and all the forms were run either through the Cultural Relations Department of the Foreign Office or the Information Research Department when that started up. And then we got into the grey areas, such as the God That Failed that Crossman set up, that sort of was supposed to be the result of a spontaneous debate, but had a lot of people who had wartime intelligence connections contributing to it. And his MI5 file also discusses his essay in the IRD, in the background books volume, Why I Oppose Communism. Now, background books were a series that was set up and run by the Information Research Department, and his MI5 file doesn't say anything about this publication, but it's got requests from the Foreign Office that were copied into MI5 saying the United States Information Service wants to copy and translate Spender's essay from this volume, will give them permission to distribute this in Italy, unless we do otherwise. I'm not putting it straight forward there, but that's what happened. So, okay, this overall pattern is that Spender was not a political innocent that was set up in an encounter with no knowledge of how these things work in 1952. He had enough that we could say that he was probably witty in the sense that someone from the Second World War that he knew would have said, look, we're thinking of doing this, you'll be given, I suspect you'll be given complete editorial freedom, do what you want with it, but just we need a safe pair of hands in there, we know from your previous work you can be trusted. And put him in a really, I can imagine, awful position that covert propaganda agencies are not bastions of intellectual integrity. So you can go in with the noblest of ambitions, but then as things start to come out, your previous situations, you deny that you know what's going on and try and maintain the situation, or do you come clean? And for his life, I imagine it was probably a decision that he made certain promises that this history of the Second World War said he wouldn't, during his lifetime, he couldn't talk about it, as so many of the others during the Second World War would never talk about that particular work, and in many ways probably stuck that through. So very quickly, just to then switch on to the other side, while this was all going on the other hand, his file shows this, as I said, crazy counter story of people investigating Encounter. Hilariously, when Special Branch discovered the operations of the British Society for Cultural Freedom and Encounter magazine, they actually thought they'd stumbled upon a Communist Front organisation and attempted to start an investigation by MI5. While they had no records of Crystal, Spender, Special Branch noted, quote, has a long record of Communist communism going back to 1936, but he is now believed to be more of a Marxist than a Stalinist, end quote. But as they decided that Spender was, quote, the only extreme political factor in the management of the magazine, they decided it would not be right at the moment to say this organisation is communist dominated. So Special Branch continued in future years to continue to watch Spender. The MI5 file has several telegrams coming in from Poland to the encounter office that were intercepted and copied into the file. And this incongruity was probably most stark in the wake of the Cambridge spy scandal. After that, there were various reviews. One review occurred in 1955. Evidently, security service officers wanted to close Spender's file down on many levels. This eventually went up to the Director General of the service, Dick White, who was still not convinced by this argument, writing that, quote, the significance of Spender's activities when working for the Daily Worker in Spain, quote, was of security interest, and there is little doubt he was pretty close associate of Burgess, at any rate before the war. Clearly, the implication in the context of these was that while others wanted to close this file in 1955, the Director General was saying, no, we need to keep it open because I'm not convinced that he is in some capacity involved either with secret work for the Soviets or somehow implicated in the defection of the Cambridge spies. So it still remains to be seen, because the file cuts off at about 59 or 60, it remains to be seen what happened after that point when MI5 actually found out that they were keeping records on someone that was involved in other aspects of the secret work. You can imagine that there'd be many unhappy officers in MI5 if the Foreign Office and SIS was actually running this organisation on their turf in Britain, although I suspect that at some level in MI5 there would have had to be liaisons over what was going on here. There were vetting forms submitted in 52 by SIS. You can find in the files of Stephen Spender and John Lehman, and they say Lehman's file, SIS is checking up on the background of British Congress for Cultural Freedom. And these forms, these vetting forms were in other files not related to this, but B26 vetting forms were described as forms for potential employees. That's not said in Spender's file or Lehman's file, but it was the same sort of form submitted for other people that were being recruited. So I'm not going to draw an inference from that, but there were definite background checks going on, probably about the same time as the RAC meeting had happened, and they were talking about that. The big question, of course, is, does this matter? Does this change our reading of Encounter? What Jason was saying, I actually wondered whether the role of someone being a witting editor was more akin to what Orwell did with his list of the IRD. Orwell wasn't necessarily wanting to blacklist people or recommending topics that were covered. He was more wanting to make sure certain people he thought were fellow travellers weren't given space. So I wonder whether the role of an editor wasn't to censor work or anything like that, but just to have someone that wouldn't give space to certain people that were perhaps putting on a front from history in the past that still weren't trusted within certain circuits. But that is a major research project in its own, and one that I'm not really going to touch here. So I've whizzed through that, but I hope that illuminates.
Thank you very much. Thank you for whizzing too. Yes. We need questions. I'll just comment briefly on this business of witting and official secrets. In England, if you join this Secret Service, you have to sign the Official Secrets Act, which is pretty binding. In America, there's this strange thing there where you're taken out to a meal and then sign a piece of document and then you're made witting. It's a big thing in the secret world. I doubt if, can I call him Dad instead of Spender? I doubt if Dan signed the Official Secret Act to begin with. He was fantastically indiscreet. I mean, he really was. For instance, when I met Tom Dryberg for the first time and disliked him at sight, he said, yes, well, he's, it doesn't matter whether you like him or not, he's Moscow's man inside the Labour Party. So I said, what? Yes, well, if we need to communicate with Moscow, we do it through Tom, because it's much the quickest way of getting to the people that you need to talk to. So I said, he's Secretary General of the Labour Party at this particular moment. I was a schoolboy. I was absolutely horrified. I thought, the Cold War, there's this side and there's that side. and he said, I think it's good that people talk to each other, don't you?
Well, he talked about those things, but then he never mentioned that he worked with political warfare executives, so maybe there were levels of secrets that could be kept.
Well, this PID business, he was quite indiscreet about that. About the PID, he said, I didn't know anything about it until I was made to fill up these things. I think he might have been tested in this. He was given some totally boring job of assimilating documents in a language which he didn't speak, for crying out loud. What use was he assembling information on Italian post-war politics? He should have been in the German department, if anywhere, because his German was a lot better. It wasn't great, but it was okay, it existed. Instead of being in Italy, where he didn't speak the language. Anyway, he said that he bumped into Lady Violet Bonham Carter in the corridor, PID. She said to him, "Oh, Stephen, I've just ordered a sortie over Verona. Such a beautiful arena, don't you think? I just had to make sure it was still all right." She had the power, because it was the Italian desk, to have some poor bastard in a Spitfire fly over Verona, take some photographs, so she could. This was the story as he told it. I'm not sure whether I can believe it or not, but it does indicate a very low level, A, of secrecy, and B, of seriousness. So I personally don't think that he was witting. I'm pretty sure he can't have signed the Official Secret Acts, otherwise the way he would have been run, if you're talking about running somebody, would have been totally different. There would have been somebody to tell them, look, just keep quiet about this in counter business, CIA, Congress of Culture. Malcolm Muggeridge would have told them.
Well, I very much doubt that he was run as an agent. I think that is.
Yeah, but if you sign an Official Secrets Act, you're in that department.
I doubt in the Second World War that they were too emphatic in you're bound by the Official Secrets Act whether you sign it or not. And the number of people being brought into secret work for a couple of days at a time for longer periods. It was only after the Cambridge spies that they started taking protective security far more secretly. I could well imagine that you'd be brought in the Second World War. You'd be given a cursory check through MI5, told this is political intelligence department, we work with other aspects that's hush-hush, but you just concentrate on this element. It seems that we come from a Cold War perspective on security intelligence and official secrets, whereas the Second World War, the political intelligence department was covered for the PWE, which emerged out of the SOE, which emerged out of the department EH. No one actually knew where the lines between all these departments would be.
Oh, that's a very good point, because there seems to me an incredible blend between what is propaganda, cultural politics, and serious politics, which is to do with telephoning someone in Moscow saying we're serious about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think we need to suppress the question. Yes?
So often happens in American voices being left out of this. This seems like a tribunal judging Goethe's comment about whether poets should deal with poetry or with politics, excuse me. But to address this side of the table, it all sounds slightly like Sudoplatov, who was Stalin's dirty tricks man, describing how he turned to Oppenheimer, which is a complete impossibility. And I've twice been aggressively recruited by the CIA, and so I can describe what that's like and might help you. But you quoted Francis Kiernan, I believe, Mary McCarthy biography. Is that the biography you're talking about?
No, it was Carol Brightman.
Okay, well, Francis just sent me this through. I guess the encounter CIA business means nothing to young people. This is the Mary McCarthy biography. They have probably never heard of Congress of Cultural Freedom either. Fact is, Spender had no wish to know who was funding Encounter. This is Mary McCarthy, and her old partisan review buddies didn't want to know either who was funding all those delightful junkets to Congress conferences in Paris, Milan, Vienna, etc., all expenses paid. Hannah Arendt, as I recall, knew what was going on, and found out, and soon stopped attending. My guess is that the Congress and Encounter did no serious harm, and they certainly funneled money to more than a few writers in need of financial help. I was actually approached by David Bruce, who was one of the founders of the CIA. His son was a very close friend of mine. My wife and I used to go and stay in their house, in the plantation house in South Side. At the time, I was working with Costa Gavras, who was a Greek communist film director, very publicly. And at the dinner table, the station boss of China said to me, "We very much like your wife's ta-ta-ta, and we don't like Costa Gavras." And that's as far as it went. I don't think anybody imagined that I could possibly be co-opted. I'm very worried that you talk about the Ford Foundation, because through 35 years of being involved with Encounter, Ford supported them. And every single director of Encounter, I asked the question of George Steiner, everybody else, including Malcolm Code, who was CP from Cambridge, are you financed by the CIA? They said absolutely not. It was Little McCarthy, Grant, and Ford. I don't know whether Ford was a CIA front or not. I don't think Stephen would have for a moment been co-opted by any of these kind of discussions. People like that don't. I also don't know how much you know about the CIA. In 1949, there was a coup in the CIA. It was an anti-Nazi left-wing Harvard operation up until then. And then it became Cold War. They had a purge. And the people that followed were incredibly ignorant, stupid people. And you actually characterized the kind of narrow-mindedness of them. They didn't understand anything about European dialectic. And I think the Partisan Review crowd, the New York Jewish crowd, were dialecticians. They were Europeans. They knew much better about this. And I'm sure that Stephen was way ahead of the game in all this. Francis, I didn't repeat it to him for your feelings. Matthew goes on to say that Stephen probably wouldn't have understood this. I'm sure Stephen understood very well, having, like Arthur Kessler, been absolutely up to his nose in the politics of the time. And all the writers at that time were quite naive people in some way, including Kessler, who was one of the founders of the Congress. He was sent by Willy Stutzenberg or whatever to Madrid to find out whether the Germans were... to find out whether the Germans were there, and he blundered into the foyer of the Ritz Hotel and saw 2 Luftwaffe people running there and thought he'd been recognized and tried to flee the country and was captured. So I don't actually see writers at all in the role of conspirators, and you use the word penetrate, which is the word I associate with rape. I don't think that if I was sitting at the table with David Bruce and his crowd, I was on the verge of being raped. They knew perfectly well to never be co-opted. I was taken into the Pentagon and had the same thing happen with the station boss for the he was the advisor of the White House in counterinsurgency. And he said, you know so much about revolutionaries, why don't you come and advise us? And the person sitting at the next desk, there was a New Yorker writer who'd been reporting on the Mujahideen, and she was in the Pentagon, and I'm sure she wasn't being co-opted either. She was probably just writing reports. I think this is a very dangerous approach that you're taking to listen to the voices of the intelligence people and try to impose that in some way on artists.
What about the intellectuals who made this case? This is not me just offering you my view. I mean, if you read the book, which I'm sure you've got better things to do, but the research that I did was not in the main anecdotal. I only used information that I had from primary sources where they were backed up. Also, I used no anonymous sources. There were many intellectuals who felt and who still feel incredibly aggrieved at this procedure. There are many people who think, still today, aggrieved that the CIA was bankrolling the organizations, let's say the magazines in this case, that they were writing for. They didn't want to be published in a magazine that was being published.
If you have to be better than hurt feelings, I mean, can we have some context here? It's not at all clear to me which side you think should have won the Cold War. And it's not at all clear to me whether you think that anybody who contributed to Encounter or edited it would have said anything different if they'd been paid for in a different way.
I love it. It always comes up, the moral equivalence, the idea that I would somehow have hoped that the communists won the Cold War.
Sorry?
Is that the implication? That,
No,
that somehow I would have hoped
you
that the
think
Soviet
should have
Union won the Cold War?
No, I'm asking you which side you think should have won, and I'm asking you second, whether you think that those who edited and wrote for Encounter would have said anything different, whether they'd been paid for it, if they'd been paid for it.
I think the question about Encounter is backwards, is going backwards in terms of what you've just said. The question about Encounter, what I tried to
Could
make...
you answer my question rather than rephrase it?
I'll answer the second bit of your question first, because that's where you end. The question about Encounter, as I tried to say earlier on, is that I think it's to do with the exclusion and the silences, rather than co-opting people to say things they wouldn't have said. The people who were writing Encounter, particularly in the political side of it, were chosen for the correct positions that they already held. They were not being manipulated, they were not being exploited, they were not being manipulated, they were not being asked to produce propaganda. I never say that. I never say
but could you tell us some of these positions that were excluded? I mean, I agree with you.
I tried to. There's a lot of documentation in my book about how about the writers who were portraying the American South were excluded from across the board from the Congress magazine. So Dermona, Preuve, encounter, and many others. There are documents from the State Department which explain why the risers of the South were considered so dangerous, because they raised questions about, the Negro question, poverty and racialism in the South, and that this was very uncomfortable because it was one of the lines that the Soviets were attacking the Americans on, was saying that they didn't have who were the Americans to tell Moscow and the Soviet Union about free votes when they still had black people in America who couldn't vote. So this was a hush-hush. There's plenty of documentary evidence, CIA, State Department, and otherwise. This was a subject that was not to be touched. There's one example. Vietnam will be another one. Encounters record on Vietnam is very poor. This is the time when
they were far from alone.
They were not alone. All the other Congress magazines shared the same demerit. The abstract expressionism, the art, the high modernist, internationalist art over national realist. I could go on. I think the exclusions are in a sense more important than the inclusions, because it's about what's not so much the bottom line of encounters, but what's left below the bottom line, or what's moved out of the margins. I think the use of the anthology is, I'm fascinated.
But perhaps the reference class would be what the rest of the press was writing about these things at the time. I'm not sure that a great deal of the American press in the late 1950s and early 60s was talking about civil rights. That came a little later.
I think
the Vietnam War, again, the protest movement was a minority case, and remained a minority case. Abstract expressionism seems to be an entirely different universe of discourse.
Regionalism was dead.
What was?
Regional painting was old hat. And Matthew, tell what you were told by Giovanni Russo about the Italian Communist Party at Venice Biennale, looking at Pollock. It's a great story.
That's my wife over there. For 50 years. Her father is Arshil Gorky, and the only time my father and her father appeared together in a newspaper article is one by Albazino, who talked about the CIA's domination of culture in the post-war Europe. Because this is a point you make in your book, that abstract expressionism, well, it did fit the bill in terms of freedom in contrast to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's a very powerful case to be made for it as a good advertisement for
if you compare
democracy.
If you compare even early Jackson Pollock to Hart Benton, who was his master, or Stuart Davis, even who's not even an abstract expressionist, to Grant Wood, who would you prefer? The Grant Wood regionalists were dead boring. I'll make an exception for George O'Keeffe, who I think is actually terrific, but otherwise. Anyway,
well, that was sort of the official art, wasn't it?
Edmund, to answer your question about corruption, nobody for one moment thinks that any of these people wrote with anything but their own personal sincerity. The question becomes, if subsequently you realize that there was a political program behind all this, and that somebody had made a selection not according to standards of good writing, but because it had to promote a particular political line, then of course you feel differently about it. You can't not feel differently about it, which suggests actually a point where I think the CIA was mad, revealing that Encounter and Grove and Monat and Tempi Moderni were financed by the CIA, really destroyed credibility in the CIA. It didn't destroy credibility in the magazines. You just felt that you'd been screwed. You, the reader, had been screwed because you didn't make it think less of these writers, all the pieces that they wrote, but you did think done over. My reaction at the time, when all this Encounter thing was going through, wasn't related to Dad's state of being upset. I could see that as being his problem, and a separate problem, because it depended on all the things which we won't be able to decide. Witting, not witting, obviously, all his friends were in military intelligence, political intelligence during the war. Can Isaiah Berlin not have told him? All these things are incidental. the fact that it was blown at that time made me personally feel fed up with both sides, whether the United States and the Soviet Union. Screw them both, you know, the left-wing propaganda which was trying to attack the United States is just as bad. It's the right-wing propaganda. There's a sense of disgust about the whole system. There didn't seem to be, you were the same age as me, you'd been in the university at that time. It did seem a monolithic system. And I submit that the fall of Encounter was much more damaging to American interests than anything that it had achieved up until that point. It was a disaster because it made you feel, well, in that case, there's absolutely no point in anything. They're corrupting, they're misusing the people who should be on their side. Yes, of course you can.
Just 2 points, because I saw many documents in Boston in the Encounter collection. First of all, what Lasky would do in the Monad and at Encounter, and I think he wasn't the only one to decide on that, was having symposia, which was like a part of the review tradition, and he would always ask for many opinions. So he wouldn't just have one piece, he would have counter pieces and discussions and stuff. You could, of course, argue that maybe piece number one was what he thought was right and the others were just there for decoration. But I think he did give the argument, you know, give space to arguments and discussions, especially with this symposium kind of style of, you know, symposium on Europe. And
okay, so this is what he says after this Writers' Congress, which is in 1948, that was the birth of this meeting, which was the birth of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the one where Freire and Hugh Trevor got so angry and wrote back. During the past few days, I have written several articles about... No, excuse me. We had invited them here, that's the intellectuals who were then having made such a mess of the Congress, such a sort of slanging match. We'd invited them here precisely because we wanted to indicate the diversity of Western ideas, the rich individuality of democratic culture, and to make possible discussion, argument, criticism, if, in the end, a certain higher democratic unity. That's the television of reading, isn't it? We want you all to disagree. That's a massive possibility because that makes a political point. That shows that we are capable of diversity, whereas in contrast, the Soviets are only capable of unity. But at the same time, there's the sting in the tail. In the end, a certain higher democratic unity, you know.
The other thing I wanted to mention is that I found in the boxes folders on the CIA story, and they had letters from readers and writers on the CIA issue. And it was interesting for me to see that, I mean, it was more supportive letters than negative. I mean, maybe he threw out the negative. You know, I'm not saying that there weren't negative letters. I mean, some letters were asking for the canceling of subscriptions and were really bad. But others were interesting because people were saying, like, if the CIA funded your journal, it's the best thing the CIA ever has done. Or of course, I sort of knew that the CIA was funding you, but I still could write what I wanted to write. And so you had those positive, you know, feedbacks. And you know, I'm not saying that there's no negative ones. I mean, people were, of course, there were fights, and people were. The Lasky family wasn't invited to parties anymore in London. You know, I'm not saying that, you know, but still, it was interesting to see those letters where people were saying, and even if that funded it, you never changed a colon without my consent. I mean, it never, and that's also something that we're Encounter very strict about. They would never change a piece without asking the author for it.
I think you're right, Maren. I think a measure of the success of Encounter is that people were not made to say things they didn't want to say. They weren't censored. They weren't excised. There were a few occasions. They're notable because they're the exception, absolutely the exception rather than the rule. I think that it's more a question of. I mean, I'd like to sort of just deal with this blank check myth. It's, you know, the CIA were paying for this and continue to pay for it and continued with it long after they should have folded their tent and left, which would have given Encounter a chance to survive, actually. But past a certain point, the involvement of the CIA guaranteed its obsolescence, which is one of the tragedies if you're a supporter of the magazine. Just from a practical point of view, it was crazy. Leave aside the moral or philosophical issues. But they continue to pay because they continue to get a very good return on their investment. It worked for them within a very subtle paradigm. It's not a question of spooks behind a bush saying, oh, you know, what are we going to put in counter this week? I never suggest that. I don't suggest that it was in its content propagandistic, but it worked and it played in a broader context of propagandizing for the American way, for the idea of a Euro-American mind that would be the place in which the future of the world was sacred, was safe. And just to revert to the question about who won the Cold War, I mean, I won't go into my personal story of my family who were all stuck on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, so I have absolutely no truck with. I didn't try and write a book about how awful the Soviet Union was. I thought we could sort of take that as a given. And there were people working in the Russian archives at the time who were much better qualified to tell the story of what the Comintern was doing in the Comintern for the first time, because there were Russian writers who were able to access those archives rather than British writers who didn't have any access to them but had access to grind. But when you say who, you know, if you ask me who won the Cold War, well, I mean, I know the wall came down, but I'm not sure who won the Cold War. I'm not sure who had the ultimate moral victory. Well, who do you, did anyone win it?
Well, I certainly think the Soviet Union lost it, let's put it that way.
It collapsed. So technically, it lost, but I'm asking about the quality of the victory, I suppose, is what I'm asking about.
That's a good question. I mean, you know, we can't ask everything at once.
What means, you know, what means justify what ends? It's all about, you know, the Jesuitical pursuit of means to an end. And that's what I question. And I try and ask what damage it might have done in the process to the idea of free and independent cultural life and expression, just taking its own momentum. Encounter would never have survived. It was financially in the red for its entire life. It would never have survived in the free marketplace of ideas.
It did survive. One of the great myths of Encounter
not everyone else has to survive just by selling copies or getting advertising. They survived because they had subventions.
Most magazines do. Most magazines do. There's nothing new about that. I don't think the Times makes a lot of money. The TLS doesn't make a lot of money. But I mean, I just wanted to challenge this myth that the Encounter collapsed in 1967. It didn't. It continued to 1990. And one of the interesting points which complicates the picture is that Conor Cruise O'Brien, who was instrumental, in nagging away at the journal and trying to sort of unpick its editorial bias, he was a contributor to the journal in the 1970s and 1980s. I mean, maybe it wasn't as prestigious, and it didn't have, it was tarnished in some sense, but it was a significant cultural voice in the 70s and 80s, and people knew it was from the right. But,
Well, I have a funny letter from the archive. I have a letter which is interesting. A year after the whole thing broke, the Rampart editor or person wrote to Encounter, please can we exchange subscriptions? This is very true. Rampart is the magazine that originally wrote the big piece. That's a couple of years after the whole thing broke.
I think there's got to be technical problems, technical answers to very specific things, such as, this is for Maren, this is what you have to look for, if I can advise, is evidence of a specific article being killed for political reasons. And I remember from my dim childhood, because it's so far away, somebody went to Cuba just after Castro went there and was very much against Castro, wrote an article, and it was published. Then he went 2 years later and was extremely impressed by the increase of education and medicine, above all. And so he wrote a very favorable article on Cuba, the changes that had taken place. And that I remember as having been killed by Lasky. Dad accepted it and somehow never got published. But I don't remember the details. I don't remember the
There was also a piece on China that came from Washington, actually. It went much further than Josselson. It came back from Washington that it was to be taken out because it was disagreeable in terms of some sensitive negotiations and US-Sino relations. So there were examples, but I really do think they were an exception. I think they were very, very astute about that. If you were going to be censoring people, then word would go up that this wasn't as free a cultural magazine as it advertises. So I don't think that. I don't think most people who didn't agree with Encounter would go anywhere near it anyway. You know, they wouldn't try and hunt for it because they knew they
What
wouldn't.
was the CIA getting out of this? I mean, you talked about certain articles being cut, but I mean, I saw the Living Theatre review. They were full of troughs. I was in the Living Theatre. What was CIA getting out of this?
Was that Michael Rudman in New York?
Waitman, Paul Waitman.
Right.
I mean, what were they actually getting out of it? It's not like commentary. I mean, Costa, when I was working with him, was ferociously attacked in commentary, but I don't remember reading things in Encounter which were particularly ideologically biased one way or the other. I mean, what was the CIA getting out of it?
It was definitely pluralist. It was the same as the idea of using abstract expressionism to promote an idea of America as free, willing, tolerant, capable of taking a certain degree of criticism, but not too much. But they wanted something that, in the broadest sense, followed American foreign policy. It's incredibly well documented. This. It's not. There are many other people who've done more research than I have on this, but it broadly followed American foreign policy objectives, and more specifically, defeated or made it hard for the Soviets to continue to peddle an image of America as intellectually barren or philistine, as gum chewing, Chevy driving, DuPont-y.
But on a scale, perhaps not as pervasive as Murdoch's influence.
Well,
it seems much worse.
The only thing I know about Murdoch, I mean, it is. All I know is that if I write for a paper, I know that Murdoch owns it, and I can make a decision about whether or not I want to get into bed with him. And if I was writing for Encounter or any of these other organisations, or being taken to any of these conferences or seminars, I couldn't make that decision. I wasn't free to make decisions about my freedom of expression.
If you suddenly discover that pluralism itself is some kind of a political gimmick, it gives you some. You just don't know where to put your faith in next. Is there any more questions, or should we go?
That's a one very direct question. Francis, how much did Irving Kristol know? Because he lived for a long time, most of his life, rather.
Yeah.
And I think he adamantly refused knowing anything and attempted to sue people if they alleged that he was aware of the sources. But I don't know if you interviewed him on actually through the behind curtain around him.
I interviewed him a lot. I have a lot of correspondence with him after the book was published. He was very upset that I'd said he'd gone to the office in the Holland and said that was a malicious rumour. And I was just taking out the book. I think I did a couple of the paper acquisition, or in the US. He basically said, it was he didn't know. He absolutely maintained he wasn't wishing.
You believe that?
Do you know? I do, because the timing for Kristol from 50 to about 57, I think he might have gone to wonder what was going on. But the timing, 53 to 57, would suggest it was quite possible for him not to. He didn't have anything like the state of portrait like
The Trots weren't trusted until they became right-wing Republicans.
So I don't think he did. But I mean, the thing about Lasky, which was interesting, was it was not just Tom Braden, but other people who said to me. Tom Braden very categorically, he said, the man we put in to Encounter was paid up, fully fledged CIA agent, was Melvin Lasky. I couldn't say, I could intimate in the book, but Lasky was still alive, and he'd indicated to me, when I'd interviewed Lasky, that that if I would be in serious trouble, and my publishers wouldn't support me. And
that comes through the book.
Yeah, so I couldn't say it, but that's what Braden said unequivocally to me, and since then other people have sort of, piled in and said, yeah, that's what they think too. But I don't have a piece of paper to prove
Thank you
it.
very much.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I was going to add something about IRD, the files of the Information Research Department, which is the one who paid Dad's check for all these years, and was the successor that's very difficult, as James points out, to find out who was connected to who, dealing with mysterious government departments. The IRD was mainly directed to picking up stories in Eastern Europe, such as soldier drunk on a binge in Dorpat or somewhere, and building it, writing an article which seems objective, saying the problem of alcoholism in the Russian army occupying Eastern Poland, or whatever it is. And this is black propaganda, and it descended straight from PWE, which after the war they discovered that black propaganda was very effective, and white propaganda was absolutely useless. So they persisted with the black propaganda. And IRD, 95% of its work was that, and it had at one point 160 people employed in Bush House, working together with people working for the BBC, writing articles and transmitting them. And it seems to me fairly, when it comes to the fact that they had a relationship with the CIA, there were these annual meetings between the IRD and mysterious people from abroad, from the United States. Frequently, a director of the BBC would be sitting in on these discussions, which makes you wonder just how secret was all this, unless directors of the BBC are supposed to sign the Official Secrets Act. Yeah. Oh, all right.
We're headed up to secret material anyway, so it's a routine.
Okay, well, you know more about that than I do. But always in these international meetings, the Brits were saying, calm down, don't make it too overt, your propaganda. The Americans arrived at something they wanted to be promoted all over Europe and in India and in the Far East, some declaration of principle about America. And the Brits would say, you can't do it like that. If you translate one article for all these countries, it'll stick out a mile that all this comes from Washington. You have to tailor things. And I think that the astonishing thing is that the same thing is said at every single meeting for something like 15 or 20 years after the Second World War, till eventually the whole thing does calm down, and propaganda, instead of being very blunt and subtle and blunt and crude, turns out to be as subtle as Encounter magazine. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.